Hello and welcome to Victoria. My name is Sanna and I'm part of the community team for Victoria, and I will be your host for this lovely panel. We will be taking a closer look at the design pillars for Victoria 3. We will not be going into the nitty-gritty details because there will be other panels during this weekend as well, but we will be taking a look at the more of the vision and the broad concept of the game. And with me, I have two extraordinary guests. We have our game director, Martin Anward. Welcome, Martin. And we also have our lead game designer, Mikael Andersson. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So, how does it feel to finally be able to talk about Victoria 3? Because it's huge.
It feels amazing. I've been waiting for this for several years to finally be able to talk about what I'm working about. And I'm really looking forward to all the panels, dev diaries, and everything else that we have coming about the game.
I am new to the world of Victoria, but I know the huge legacy that the brand has. And it's been such a hard secret to keep. Mikael, hasn't it been really hard to keep this secret?
Yeah, no, it's been a journey, and it feels very strange to be here, but I'm very excited.
It's so strange to not have to hide all of this. It's really, really cool. Yeah. So game pillars, Martin, can you talk a bit about what game pillars are?
Of course. So game pillars or design pillars is something we use for pretty much any game we make at PDS. Paradox Development Studio, that is. Game pillars forms the very much core vision and are often developed very early during concepting. You set down what is the game supposed to be, what are supposed to be the central themes for it, and what is it supposed to be, and more importantly, not to be. And then when you actually build a game and you design all the features and whatnot, you constantly refer back to the design pillars and you look, we have this cool idea, but does this follow the design pillars? Because you don't just want to throw every cool idea you have into the game. You have to consider what game you're trying to build and whether those ideas will work together.
Yes, of course. So the first design pillar we're talking about today is national gardening. What is national gardening?
National gardening is the principle we set out that the main experience of Victoria 3 is aimed towards the player's country and what's going on inside the player's borders. Now in Victoria 3, as in, for instance, Stellaris, you're playing a country. But in a lot of our other games, most of what's going on outside your borders can be just as important as what's going on inside your borders. And of course, we still have all of these countries, everything going on in the world, just like our other grand strategy games. But Victoria 3 is more inwards focused. What's happening with your politics, with your economy, and with your pops is more important than interactions with other states.
Mikael, Martin mentioned POPs. What are POPs?
So POPs was originally an acronym. It stands for part of population, and it's basically a demographic, right? It was introduced in the very first Victoria game and has become a beloved part of many PDS games since. In Victoria 3, we continue to use the Victoria POP system. So it's our most detailed POP simulation system yet. Actually goes even deeper than in previous titles. And this is the way that we quantify your population in your country, because having millions of people can be really hard to keep track of, and they all need to have an impact on your country. So we split them up into these demographic chunks that all have their culture and religion.
Martin, this game, you're describing it as a society builder. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, of course. So much like in a city builder, it's all about what kind of city you want to build. Victoria 3 is all about what kind of society you're building. Either because you're aiming for a specific goal, or you're just following the political currents, the movements, and the will of your population. So there's a lot of different societies that are simulated in Victoria 3, everything from agrarian feudal states to modern social democracies. And your country, of course, will end up being shaped over the course of the game by both your actions and the will of your people. And in the end, which society you end up with and how your country changes and how it looks towards the end is the most fundamental part to how this is as a society builder. And Mikael, we actually coined this concept. I'm not sure if it's been used otherwise, at least not for us, because we were trying to sort of describe what is this game ultimately about? What are you aiming to do?
Yeah, exactly. And I think one of the things to consider also when we think of a city builder, usually the goal is to make the biggest city, right? And that is not really the goal here. We have to accommodate all kinds of different utopian societies and dystopian societies, for that matter, right? Because that's what this game is about. It's about setting a goal. What do I want my Britain to be, or my Brazil to be, right? And strive towards that goal. And I think the payoff really for the player is seeing like how well am I able to do that and also secure my place in the world.
Yeah, and I really think the Victoria Pop system here is something that actually very much allows us to do this because of its considerable detail and just how many different states of being for your population it can simulate.
But Martin, it sounds like it's very much about your country, not so much about the rest of the world. War is not a huge thing in this society builder.
No, and I mean, of course, I want to emphasize that all the countries in the world, of course, have this going on. And you can't just ignore everyone else all of the time. It naturally depends on your strategic situation and so on. But one of the aims we had going into this game is that we didn't want war to be the main source of enjoyment, the main source of strategic and tactical decisions. War should not be driving the gameplay. This is not a map painter. So one thing we set out to do is that you should be able to play the entire 100-year campaign, never get into armed conflict, and still have a grand old time.
For me, as a new player of GSGs overall, I think that sounds great because I'm not that war-oriented. The whole idea of building my own society appeals much more to me, I have to say. So that makes me really happy.
Yeah, I feel like personally, I started dipping my toes into this with Stellaris and its different ethics and so on. And for me, it is really interesting always what's going on inside the player's country, with the player's population, and the feeling that you're really shaping a unique society. So it has been a big draw for me in designing and building this game, and something I think I will, or I know I personally enjoy when playing.
And that really ties in to the next game pillar that we're talking about. Mikael, can you talk a little bit about diplomatic eminence? What is that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's important to consider that just because war is not central to the enjoyment of the experience, of course, the threat of war is clearly a major theme in the era and something that we have to simulate, right? Because power comes from the barrel of the gun, and so building up your military and using that as a means of getting your diplomatic goals through is still something that you need to be doing. So in terms of this game pillar, diplomatic eminence, the important thing is that everything that you can get from war you should also be able to get without going to war. If you can create the right situation where you can get the right people on your side to push the balance of power in the direction you want. And diplomacy should always include these kind of standoffs between countries, and should always be tense diplomatic sort of negotiations rather than just simple interactions.
So a little bit more like, say, a game of poker or something like that.
Yeah, we have a mechanic for this called diplomatic plays, which is essentially what Mikael just described, is that it's a lead up, or rather, it's an attempt to get something from someone that can result in war, but if you play your cards right, you can get what you want, be it a state, to force someone to open their market, a port in a strategic location, or a whole host of other things without a gun ever being fired.
Do you have any great historic examples of this sort of thing? Because this feels very true to life.
Well, I just mentioned opening a market, and I think a pretty good example is the opening of Japan by the United States Admiral Perry. I think he was an admiral, and his black ships, where he essentially sailed to Japan, parked his black ships there with their big imposing guns, and said, "I want you to open up the country." And of course, the US was not the only ones ended up involved in this. There were other great powers, but there was nobody really willing to back Japan against the US. So ultimately, Japan figured, okay, it's better to open my market and not be invaded.
Mikael, great powers is something that we mentioned in this section. Do you need to be a great power, or what's the end goal here for you as a player?
Sure. I mean, becoming a great power, I think, is a very common default goal for a lot of players, and advancing up the rank of prestige in the world is definitely something that you'll be spending a lot of time doing. But you don't have to be a great power in order to enjoy the game. You should be able to start as a really minor power and just try to become a locally powerful nation, for example. But then you have to contend with the fact that there are these global empires in the world that sometimes can push their weight around. And you have to decide sort of what power block do you want to be a part of if you're not able to become a great power yourself.
Moving on to the next design pillar here, and this is my favorite one, I think. Everything is political. Martin, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds very edgy.
It does.
But ultimately what it's about is that politics is very core to Victoria 3. And everything in the game is supposed to in some way flow from and or tie back into politics. Your pops are supposed to have an opinion on things like whether you're at war, diplomacy, the economy, of course, very heavily ties into politics. And nothing is supposed to be, politically agnostic, because you're simulating a country full of people with opinions about everything. And they generally convey those opinions through what we call interest groups.
Okay. Mikael, can you tell us a little bit about interest groups?
Sure. So managing politics in a nation of millions of people is tricky, right? So the pops lend their political strength to these sort of political avatars or factions called interest groups. So each country has about 8 of them active at any time. And they represent different interests in your country. So you might have the landowner interest groups that prefer for things to be aristocratic and conservative, or the industrialists that would prefer a more open economy, but still enjoy the stratification of society. So there are these 8 factions that can be different between different countries. But they represent the same sort of niche. And depending on the pops, how wealthy they are, what kind of job they have, where they work, things like that. They will support one or the other of these groups. And that's what determines really what the political power balance of your country is, and what the pops in your country are driving towards in terms of what kind of reforms they want to see from you.
Yeah, I mean, judging by your clothes, I think I might be more in the landowner's direction. What would you say you would belong to, Mikael?
I'm in the trade unions.
Disgusting.
But it all really boils down to pops, really, Martin, doesn't it?
Of course.
Yes.
In the end, interest groups get their political strength from pop. And of course, it's not as simple as that just every pop belongs to an interest group. It depends on things like literacy, cultural and religious discrimination, and a multitude of other factors to determine whether pops lend support to a particular interest groups or whether they get involved in politics or are allowed to be involved in politics at all.
And that is kind of steered by politics in the end.
In the end, everything is political.
It really is. What if I, as a player, dream of just having a fully unified country that just backs me up at every decision? Like, will I achieve that utopia?
I would say you would find that, I would not say impossible, because our players keep surprising us about what is and isn't impossible, but I would say it would be extremely difficult.
Also, not very realistic at all.
No. Precisely, because, you're not going to get everyone to agree. You're not going to get every single person in your country agreeing that this is the way to go. They're going to have different opinions about things, and sometimes, even though you, of course, know what's best for your pops, they might not agree. And you might have to sort of drag them kicking and screaming and fighting you all the way into the glorious future you're envisioning, while, reasonably everyone should just agree with you.
But, Mikael, maybe you can tell a little bit more about this. The interest groups, what is it that really makes the power shift between them over the time as you play?
So pops gain political strength depending on how wealthy they are and what kind of voting franchise you have in your country, if any, and a number of other things. So the pops will support different interest groups with their political strength. So as an example, right, you mentioned that can you ever get this unified country? If I wanted to create like a social democratic laborer's paradise, then I need to create a lot of jobs that are well-paying jobs for people in industry, probably, and create the kind of legal expectations that they would have. As a result, I will then get rid of a lot of my aristocracy, and maybe with the right economic system, maybe even a lot of the capitalists in the country will disappear, and I will have something akin to my laborer's paradise. But there's always going to be some part of the population, right, that oppose this.
Yeah, to give an example, if you have a heavily industrialized country, but you're a repressive oligarchy, then your wealthy people, your capitalists, the ones in the upper strata, will have a lot more political power than they would in a country with universal suffrage or even a more limited voting franchise and a more equal distribution of resources. But that, of course, might backfire on you because people generally don't like being poor and starving and might expect a better life than your stratocratic oligarchy is giving them. But ultimately, this is what it comes down to when we say everything is political. There are so many factors feeding into this and the political distribution of your interest groups.
Yes, of course. Speaking of how things change over time, the next design pillar we're talking about is an era of change. And Mikael, can you tell us a little bit more about the era of change? What does that design pillar mean?
Absolutely. So one of the design challenges, and also the most exciting thing about designing this game, is that this was such a tremendous era of change. From 1836 to 1936, you had the industrial revolutions. You had political revolutions as well in the mid game and the late game that were absolutely transformative, right? And we had to make sure that all of this was reflected in our game mechanics, so that it didn't feel like the same game to play in the late game as in the early game. Militarily, economically, politically, right? You should be facing different challenges all the time, and the country you end up with will never be the same as the country you started with.
This was, of course, an era where there was a lot of change and very, very big differences between different countries, technology-wise. Do you want to talk about that?
No, of course. Technology is, of course, a very integral part of the game. And we have set out to make sure that technology feels as impactful as it should. Like Mikael just said, technology was revolutionary during this era. It's the time when it really took off, when things started changing, when life could look very different in just a span of 5 to 10 years. So we really want technology in Victoria 3 to feel as revolutionary as it was to the people at the time. That it should change your country, change your economy, change your politics, and how your people look at the world. And naturally, there is also significant difference, as you say. Some countries start with more of a head start, others are further behind, and that is also, of course, a factor that has to be considered into your position, and again, ties into your place in the pecking order, to go back a few points. And all of this really, I think, makes up the core of the era of Change Pillar.
Yes, and it's very, very interesting. You can almost look at it as a race against all the other countries to make sure you keep up with the technology that is changing constantly.
And unlike the previous games, one thing that is very important in this game is the concept of technology spread. Not just inventing things yourself, but making sure that there is a good flow of ideas into your country, because one country will not usually be able to be at the spearhead of everything. So you kind of have to focus, what do you want to focus on? But also educate your population so they are open to technology spread, perhaps enhance it through diplomacy, and generally, if you're behind, try to catch up. If you're ahead, try to stay there.
Mikael, do you have anything to say about technology, how it has changed over time, and the balance, if you will?
I have a suggestion.
Yes.
Ask Mikael to name a few of his favorite technologies in the game.
Yes,
if
that's
you
a
think
very
you can
good
do
one.
that off the top of your head.
Yes. Hold on, then I will ask. Mikael, speaking of technology, do you have any favorites of the different technologies you can research in the game?
Oh, that's a really hard question. I can name a couple. So we have three main types of technology, and you can only research one at a time. There's the economical ones, or production-based ones. There's military, and there's society. And society is more like ideas, right? And all of these can have technologies that are kind of dangerous for you. And those are probably my favorites. So Martin mentioned technology spread as well. If you are a country that wants to avoid the problems of, let's say, to use a very stereotypical example here, socialism. If you want to try to avoid that happening to your country, you could try to not research that, right? That's easy enough to do, but you can't really avoid it spreading to your country. It will happen sooner or later. And the question is, when does that happen, right? So that's one of them. On the production side, I'm really fascinated by the automation techs because they improve the They improve the economic output of your country, but they also displace a large part of your country and create a totally different political situation. So those are all really interesting ones to me.
Yeah, and that goes back to everything being political, of course.
Yes. Indeed.
And that is all we had for today, actually. We've discussed all of the game pillars, and thank you so much for being here, Martin.
Thank you for having us.
Mikael, you've been fantastic. It's been a very interesting discussion.
Yes, thank you.
And we have more to share about Victoria 3. We have a couple more panels over the weekend, but we also have a lot more to share on our social media and our website going forth. So make sure to follow us everywhere. But more importantly, log on to Steam, search for Victoria 3, and add it to your wish list. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.